Hello, I'm Catherine Smith, and I'm 42 years old. I run a fashion company and got married 2 years ago to Bob, who's 2 years younger than me. Our marriage was arranged. Bob is the son of Mr. Smith, the CEO of a company I had worked with for years. Being an only child, Mr. Smith seemed to want Bob to take over his company. But Bob wasn't interested and wasn't particularly good at the job, so he ended up working as a regular employee instead. What drew me to Bob was his laid-back nature. Growing up, people always said I was too serious and lacked spontaneity. I was praised for being studious, but many found me too stiff. Some of my ex-boyfriends even said, "You're not fun. It's like I'm dating a boss." Those comments hurt, but they made me realize that maybe I was too serious. I struggled to be casual and often got too engrossed in things. Bob, on the other hand, seemed to be from a different world. During our first date, Bob took me to a restaurant he liked, but it was closed. I would have been flustered, but not Bob. He just said, "Let's go to that diner over there," and changed plans effortlessly. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought that by being with him, I could also become more adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't enthusiastic. He asked me, "Are you sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him." Back then I felt no one really understood Bob's worth, but maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith inquired about the reason, Bob nonchalantly said, "Wait, why do I need to work if you are making money for us both?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback by this that we were at a loss for words. Why would he rely solely on me for income? I tried to persuade Bob multiple times afterward with my father-in-law, but Bob's mindset never changed. After all, even if I work, I can't make as much as Catherine does. I was tempted to divorce Bob right after our marriage when he boldly declared he'd be a freeloader. If he was a young man in his 20s, I might have found this cute, but this tantrum was coming from a man approaching 40. In the end, we begrudgingly agreed that he'd do the household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier. Apparently, before the divorce, Bob's mother wasn't particularly good at housework. She couldn't do anything, so I never learned anything from her. It seemed like Bob was making excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. True to his word, at first, Bob was clueless about housework. But with persistent praise and guidance, he managed to handle basic tasks. However, that doesn't mean he became exceptionally good at it. Still, he looked quite satisfied with himself. "Thanks to you taking care of the house, Catherine can work. You should be grateful." There was something about Bob's confident expression that rubbed me the wrong way, but it wasn't worth making a fuss about. "Yes, Bob, I'm really grateful for your help," I said, forcing a smile. There were times I got irritated, but I think we managed to get along quite well. About a year into our marriage, a significant event occurred. My father-in-law adopted a child, a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack seemed like any ordinary boy. My father-in-law is the type of person who doesn't make senseless decisions, so why did he suddenly adopt Jack? One day, when we were alone, I asked him. He replied, "Promise you won't tell anyone," and then explained. It turns out Jack was the child of an employee whom my father-in-law had been fond of. Having had a close relationship with the family, my father-in-law cared for Jack like a grandson. Tragically, a while back, Jack's parents died in an accident. Jack's parents had eloped, and he had no close relatives to rely on. Otherwise, he would have ended up in a foster home. While my father-in-law wasn't sure if Jack would be happy with us, he decided to adopt him, hoping it'd be for the best. "I see. That's very kind of you." Although Bob and I didn't have children, we had quite a bit of freedom. "Please rely on me if you need anything." Upon hearing this, my father-in-law smiled warmly. After that, thankfully, my father-in-law relied on me from time to time, just as I had asked. On nights when he absolutely couldn't make it back from work or when he had pressing commitments, I took care of Jack. At first, Jack was a bit apprehensive, but he warmed up quickly. He's either very friendly or trying hard to fit in. Thinking about it made me feel somewhat emotional. Bob, on the other hand, wasn't thrilled about the situation. It seemed he wasn't exactly welcoming toward Jack. I could understand his mixed feelings, knowing his father took in a stranger, but when I tried talking to Bob, it turned out he had a completely different concern. Adopting him? What's he thinking? This is going to cut into my inheritance. I was hoping to get everything. I couldn't believe my ears. Bob wasn't feeling conflicted about Jack. He was worried about the inheritance. I'm going to talk to Dad about this. I'm not cool with it. One day, Bob said this and went to confront his father. When he returned after a while, to my surprise, he was in a strangely good mood. I cautiously asked a smiling Bob, "How did it go?" He replied, "Oh, it's all good. My share isn't changing." Huh? What do you mean? I'd always thought that even an adopted child like Jack had the same inheritance rights as a biological child. What's going on here? Noticing my confusion, Bob smugly explained, "Dad's making Jack give up his inheritance rights. Makes sense. I'm his only son after all." Could the father-in-law who spoke of Jack with such affection really plan on leaving him nothing after his passing? Something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't convinced, but Bob said with relief, "I'm glad." Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason behind it. Either way, he is still in his 60s. We probably won't be dealing with any inheritance for a while. In fact, it seems more likely that I divorce Bob before my father-in-law passes away. I was nonchalantly pondering such thoughts. However, that moment came much sooner than expected. A year later, my father-in-law was involved in an accident and never came back. I never thought I'd say goodbye to him so soon. I've known my father-in-law longer than I've known Bob. He was a respectable man, both in his professional and private life. After hearing the news, I was overcome with a sense of loss and tears wouldn't stop flowing. My eyes heavy from crying and my head throbbing, I forced myself to prepare for the funeral. Bob was the main mourner, but he didn't seem to be grieving. He just seemed distant. His father had passed away so suddenly. Perhaps Bob was in such shock that it didn't feel real. I had to step up and make preparations to bid farewell to my father-in-law on behalf of Bob. I felt like crying but somehow held back during the funeral. As hard as it was for me, seeing Jack cry was the most heartbreaking. Throughout it all, Bob didn't shed a single tear. That's when I began to find his behavior peculiar. Rather than grieving, Bob seemed restless or even giddy. Sometime after the commotion, the reason became clear. "Bob, isn't something off with you? Aren't you sad about your dad's passing?" I intended my comment to reflect concern about his lack of tears, but his response caught me off guard. Of course I'm sad, but I'm also kind of thrilled." Oops, guess my joy showed, huh? Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He's bound to have some money. How much do you think he left behind? Geez, how awful could this be? I had thought Bob was just zoning out. From before the funeral up to now, he hadn't been mourning his father at all, but grinning, thinking about the inheritance. What on earth are you thinking? Well, think about it. We're divorced and my mom doesn't have any of it. I'm his only blood child. Jack, being adopted, won't inherit anything, so all the inheritance is mine. You think I can't be thrilled about that? Bob had a face that looked like he was about to burst into laughter any moment. Seeing that face made me feel like I was going to slap him. That's how much Bob's face had relaxed. He was truly delighted from the bottom of his heart that my stepfather had passed away. I can't believe it. Say whatever you want. I just wanted to leave right then, but before that, there was something I had to tell Bob about Jack. Now that my stepfather's gone, I've temporarily asked Bob to keep Jack at our place, but if things continue like this, Jack will have to go to a foster home. In that case, I want to raise Jack with my own hands. That's what I was thinking about. Jack, yeah, you going to take him in? Sounds good to me. I was surprised by how easily Bob agreed, and he continued with a smile. After all, what you do, Catherine, has absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. Then he held up a single piece of paper to me. It was a green paper, a divorce paper. What's this? Confused, I asked, and Bob crisply replied, let's get a divorce now that I've got the inheritance. I don't need my personal ATM mute anymore. For a moment, I didn't understand what Bob was saying. Did he just call me an ATM and even say I'm no longer needed? What do you mean? When I asked, Bob smirked and proudly told me, I got around $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Bob continued, with this much, I don't have to work anymore. I don't need to please you. I don't have to bother with tedious chores. Oh, how wonderful. With exaggerated gestures, Bob openly expressed his joy. I was deeply shocked. Seeing this side of Bob, the inheritance was money that came in after my stepfather's death, yet he's rejoicing as if he won the lottery. As I've been feeling, Bob doesn't seem to mourn or remember my stepfather. He's genuinely happy. But money is a scary thing. It's not uncommon for people to change dramatically after getting a huge sum. Perhaps with such a large amount in front of him, Bob's just getting a bit carried away. Calm down, Bob. Look, let's talk first. I put my hand on Bob's shoulder, but Bob quickly shrugged it off and shouted at me with fury, Shut up, you boring woman. I married you because you were introduced by my father and you were a CEO, but I always felt suffocated with you. It's hard for me. Bob listed his grievances against me. I was so disappointed when I expected someone better from the arranged date my dad set up, but then got someone plain like you. If that's the case, he could have just refused the match. I never forced him or passionately persuaded him to marry me. Being portrayed as the victim didn't sit right with me. So why did you marry me then? If you had declined, that would have been fine. It's obvious, for the money. Who else would marry someone like you? Bob laughed at me, mocking. Basically, he married me for my wealth. Bob started with, It's been a while, so I guess it's safe to say, and revealed a shocking fact. I had a significant debt. My dad said if I changed my ways and devoted myself to you, he would pay it off. So of course I would marry you. It meant he never loved me, he just married me for the money. Well, it wasn't fun, but thanks to you, I was saved. Thanks a lot. Seeing Bob laughing crudely, I made up my mind. I don't know this man anymore. I decided not to give him the advice I had planned on and just started filling out the divorce papers. Without hesitation, I wrote without pausing or second-guessing. Bob, who had been urging the divorce, seemed a bit surprised to see this. Hey, are you thinking of getting a divorce now? Fine, here's the divorce papers. After writing them, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Now we're total strangers. Yeah, whatever happens now doesn't concern the other. You can live with that kid, Jack, and I can hang out with younger women. We're free. Bob was ecstatic. From what I could see, he hadn't cheated during our marriage. I never suspected it, but that was a point of interest. But Bob, if you were this happy about it, you should have divorced sooner. I had my reasons. I wanted the money. Bob carelessly stuffed the divorce papers into his bag and left the house in a hurry. I didn't feel right staying in the house where I'd lived with Bob. I was thinking of starting fresh somewhere new with Jack. This seemed like a good time to sell the house and move. I'd love to live close to my parents' place. I think it would help both Jack and me. Jack will have to transfer schools, but he said that's okay. It's a bit sad, but now we can look for a new place without any reservations. Finding a new place was a bit of a challenge, but after some thought, I made a choice. The main deciding factors were the short distance to my parents and the great location. It's pricey, but considering Jack, I think it's the best property out there. Jack accompanied me to view the property, and his eyes lit up at the sight of the luxurious house. It's spacious and elaborately decorated. There's plenty of storage, which was a concern of mine, and surprisingly, it even came with a pool. Honestly, I didn't need a pool, but seeing Jack's excitement made it worth it. Wow, this is amazing. It would have been fine for me to live anywhere, but seeing him happy was what mattered most. and so we moved. It took a while for both Jack and me to adjust, but eventually our new house became a comforting place. Around that time, I got a call from Bob. He seemed desperate and said he wanted to meet and apologize immediately. I had an idea why he'd suddenly say that. I could have ignored him, but since he was so insistent, I decided to meet. I left Jack with my mother and headed to the diner I had specified. Bob had arrived earlier. He was sitting in a corner booth looking pale and on the verge of tears. "Catherine." I gave Bob a cold look as he stood up upon seeing me. "What do you want, Bob? We're supposed to be strangers now." "Don't say that. The truth is, my dad had debts. Dan, I never thought he'd." "So what? You inherited $1 million, right? Just pay it off." No, the debts. They're more than the inheritance." It seemed the debt exceeded the $1 million inheritance, so after inheriting both the assets and the liabilities, Bob was now saddled with debt. I didn't know I'd inherit the debt too. Bob looked defeated. "Please, Catherine, you must have some savings. We were married once, please help me out." He pleaded with a flattering smile. Did Bob even remember what he said before? "After all the times you belittled me, even calling me an ATM, who would want to help you now?" It was audacious of him to contact me. He'd said over the phone that he wanted to apologize, but he hasn't done so yet. "You really regretted our marriage, didn't you? After everything you said, how can you ask for help now?" Well, back then, I never imagined this would happen. His convenience astounded me. He probably thought he wouldn't need money from me anymore, but now that he does, he's growling. It seemed that way. "Sorry, but I can't meet your expectations. I don't have the money." "What are you talking about? I know your business is thriving." Liar. I wished he'd stop blaming me, an innocent bystander, for his own mistakes. "I'm not lying. I just don't have the money to lend to you. Not every bank lends to everyone, right? Why would I lend if I don't expect it back?" Bob remembered the harsh words he once threw at me and looked a bit guilty, yet he doesn't apologize. Such a proud man. What's with the cold shoulder? Don't you care what happens to me? Oh, did you forget what you said when we got divorced? We're strangers now, nothing to do with each other. Weren't those your words? I don't understand how he can act like he's the victim. How thick-skinned can he be? Does he have the ability to forget everything that doesn't suit him? I wish I had recorded what he said back then and could play it back to him. I might have said something like that, but I didn't mean it. I never imagined things would turn out this way. Bob leaned on the table, looking sad. "I thought about the life insurance, but my dad's lawyer said I'm not the beneficiary." "Oh, really?" I laughed at his statement, which made Bob look at me in shock. "You don't think, Catherine, did my dad leave it to you?" "No, it's not me." "Then why'd you laugh?" "Just felt a bit sorry for you, that's all. If it was insurance, I wouldn't have inherited the debt." Exactly. That's why my father-in-law had Jack renounce the inheritance. He had left something for Jack in the form of life insurance. The beneficiary of my father-in-law's life insurance was Jack. Is that all you wanted to talk about? If so, I'm leaving. There's nothing I can do for you. Wait, can't we start over? I was just upset about my dad back then, but I truly care about you, Catherine. You mean you only see me as a dollar sign, right? I know Bob was denying and saying all sorts of things, but I'm not getting fooled again. After all, I don't have a single dime to give to someone like him. Well, someone important is waiting for me at home. With that, I left the diner. I could hear Bob crying out in a pitiful manner, but to me, it was just noise. I need to hurry home. Jack might be hungry, or maybe he got something from his grandma. I quickly headed to the subway station. As for Bob, I heard he's working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no work experience, qualifications, or motivation, he couldn't get a full-time job anywhere. I once saw him working at a convenience store while I was on my way to a client. He looked much older and thinner, quite shocking. Bob, who had been living off others, was now facing the consequences. There's no sympathy for him. On the other hand, I'm living peacefully with Jack. We even argue sometimes now. It's saddening when Jack ignores me after a fight, but I try to see it as a sign that he's opening up to me. I plan to support him until he can stand on his own 2 feet. That's probably what my father-in-law wished for, and it's my goal in life now.
My name is Emily Harrison. At 35, I've carved out a life balancing being a mother to a vibrant 5-year-old son and working in the business my parents built from scratch. My husband, Daniel, had always been the pillar I leaned on, or so I thought. I still remember the evening that shattered everything. We were at dinner, the clinking of cutlery mingling with our son's laughter. That's when Daniel dropped the bombshell. "You work for your parents who didn't even finish high school? That's embarrassing, Emily," he said, his fork pausing midair. I choked on my water. "What? Why does that matter now?" Daniel shrugged, a look of disdain creeping onto his face. "I just thought you came from a more educated family. It's not a good look, associating with dropouts." I stared at him, my heart pounding. This was the man who'd vowed to love and respect me, the man who'd embraced my parents like his own. Yet here he was, sneering at their life's work. "But they've built a successful company, Daniel. They worked hard for everything we have," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He scoffed. "Hard work? Please. They probably just got lucky. It's not like they had the brains to do something significant." The words stung like a slap. I looked across the table, at our son who was blissfully unaware, munching on his food. How could I explain to him one day that his father looked down on his grandparents? "Daniel, they're my parents. You've known them for years. Why are you saying this now?" My voice was a whisper, laced with disbelief and pain. He leaned back, his eyes cold. "I guess I just never realized how limited their education was. It's not something to be proud of, Emily, and frankly, it reflects poorly on us." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The man sleeping beside me felt like a stranger. His words echoed in my mind, each syllable a sharp jab at my heart. My parents, who'd sacrificed everything to give me a life they never had, were now a source of shame for my husband. The Emily who had fallen in love with Daniel couldn't reconcile with this new reality. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping. This was just the beginning, the first crack in the facade of our seemingly perfect life. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and cold silences. Daniel's disdain for my family had seeped into every aspect of our lives. I watched as the man I married transformed into someone unrecognizable, someone who found pleasure in belittling others. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, Daniel walked in, his face stern. "Emily, we need to talk about your job," he began, his tone leaving no room for argument. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "What about my job, Daniel?" He leaned against the counter, his eyes cold. "I think it's time you considered quitting. Be a full-time housewife. It's not like your job at that rinky-dink company means anything." I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of anger. "My job means a lot to me, Daniel. My parents built that company from nothing. It's important." He laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Important? Please, Emily. It's a small-time operation. You'd be better off focusing on our home." I shook my head, disbelief and anger intertwining. "I won't quit my job, Daniel. It's part of who I am." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Who you are. You're my wife, Emily. Your place is here, with our son, not wasting time at some dead-end job." I stared at him, the man I no longer recognized. "My parents' business isn't dead-end, and I am not just your wife, I am also a daughter and a professional." His laughter echoed in the kitchen. "Professional? That's a good one. You're playing at a job, Emily. Time to grow up and see what's really important." That night, I lay awake, the words and laughter haunting me. It was clear that Daniel's arrogance and contempt knew no bounds. His disregard for my identity, my family, and my aspirations was not just painful, it was suffocating. As the days turned into weeks, the idea of a life without Daniel started to grow in my mind. A life where I didn't have to defend my parents or my choices. A life where my son wouldn't hear his father mock his grandparents. But I knew that leaving Daniel wouldn't be enough. He needed to understand the pain he caused, to feel the sting of his own venom. I needed to stand up for my parents, for myself. The storm was rising, and I was ready to face it head on. Daniel's promotion at work brought a new wave of arrogance that was unbearable. He strutted around the house like a peacock, his ego inflated to the point of bursting. One Saturday morning, as I was preparing breakfast, he sauntered into the kitchen with a smirk. "Guess who just got a big promotion? This means we're moving up in the world, Emily." I forced a smile, trying to keep the peace. "That's great, Daniel. Congratulations." He poured himself a coffee, his smirk widening. "With this raise, you really don't need to work anymore. You can finally quit that silly job of yours." I stiffened, my spoon clattering against the pan. "We've been over this, Daniel. I'm not quitting my job." He leaned against the counter, his gaze piercing. "You're still on about that? Emily, be reasonable. You won't have to lift a finger. I can provide everything." The condescension in his voice was like a slap. "It's not about the money, Daniel. I work because I love my job. It's part of who I am." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Love your job? That's just sentimental nonsense. You need to start thinking about what's best for our family." I turned off the stove, my hands trembling. "And what if I think working is what's best for me? For our family?" His eyes narrowed. "You're being selfish, Emily. You're not seeing the big picture. It's time you started acting like a proper wife and mother." The words hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about my job anymore. This was about control, about Daniel dictating how I should live my life. I looked at him, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "And what if I don't want the life you're offering?" His expression darkened. "Is that a threat, Emily?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's a promise. I won't let you or anyone else dictate my life." The air between us was electric, charged with unspoken threats and shattered illusions. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. The man I married was gone, replaced by a stranger with whom I shared a house but not a life. As he left the room, the silence was deafening. But within me, a plan was forming. A plan to reclaim my life, to show Daniel he couldn't trample over me. The seeds of revenge were sown, watered by every condescending word and every dismissive gesture. It was time for Daniel to learn that underestimating me was his biggest mistake. The following weeks were a tense chess game with Daniel. His arrogance reached new heights, but I was busy laying the groundwork for what was to come. One day, I was called into an unexpected meeting at work. My father looked grave as he introduced me to Mr. Anderson, a project manager from a collaborating firm. "Emily, we have a serious issue," my father began, his voice heavy with concern. "It's about a project your husband is leading." My heart sank. "What about it?" Mr. Anderson cleared his throat, his expression grim. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Daniel has been manipulating the project for his gain." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "He's been diverting resources to another firm, and there are rumors of him being involved with someone from that company," Mr. Anderson said hesitantly. The room spun around me. "An affair?" The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "We can't confirm that," my father interjected, his face etched with worry. "But the evidence against him is quite damning." I sat there numb. The man I had married, the father of my child, was not only jeopardizing my family's business, but possibly having an affair. Rage bubbled inside me, a burning, seething cauldron of betrayal and hurt. "What do you plan to do?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "We need to gather more evidence," Mr. Anderson said, "but we need to be discreet. If Daniel realizes we're onto him, he might cover his tracks." I nodded, a plan forming in my mind. "I'll help. He won't suspect me." Over the next few days, I played the dutiful wife, while secretly gathering evidence with Mr. Anderson and my father. Each document I found, every covert conversation I overheard, was another piece in the puzzle of Daniel's deceit. But it wasn't just about the project anymore. I needed to know the truth about the alleged affair. If Daniel could betray my family's business, what else was he capable of? I hired a private investigator, my resolve steeling with every passing day. If Daniel was leading a double life, I would expose him for the fraud he was. The day the investigator handed me the envelope felt surreal. Inside were photos and messages that confirmed my worst fears. Daniel was indeed having an affair. Tears of anger and hurt blurred my vision as I looked at the pictures. But amidst the pain, there was clarity. Daniel had underestimated me for the last time. It was time for his house of cards to come tumbling down. Armed with the truth, my determination to bring Daniel down became unshakable. I met with Mr. Anderson and my father, our meeting charged with a sense of urgency. "We have enough to go public with his misconduct," Mr. Anderson said, his voice grim. "But we need to be strategic about this." I nodded, my mind racing with possibilities. We can't just expose his professional misconduct. We need to reveal his personal betrayal as well. It has to be a complete takedown. My father looked at me, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. "Emily, are you sure you want to do this? It's going to get ugly." I clenched my jaw, feeling a surge of resolve. He made it personal when he betrayed our family. I'm ready. Over the next few days, we meticulously planned our course of action. Mr. Anderson gathered the necessary evidence from the project, while I compiled the proof of Daniel's affair. The plan was to confront him at his company, where he could not escape the consequences of his actions. The day of reckoning came swiftly. Daniel left for work, unaware that his world was about to crumble. I arrived at his office with Mr. Anderson and my father, our faces set in determination. We confronted him in the conference room, the evidence laid out like a damning mosaic of his deceit. Daniel's face paled as he realized the extent of our knowledge. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Daniel blustered, trying to regain his composure. "No joke, Daniel," I said, my voice steady. "We know everything. The sabotage of the project, the affair. All of it." He scoffed, trying to brush it off. "You have no proof." Mr. Anderson stepped forward, laying out the documents and photos. "We have all the proof we need. Your career is over, Daniel." Daniel's eyes darted around the room, desperation creeping into his expression. "You can't do this to me. I've worked too hard to get here." I looked at him, my heart void of any affection I once had. "You should have thought of that before you betrayed us all." The meeting ended with Daniel being escorted out of the building, his career in tatters. As he passed me, his eyes met mine, a mixture of shock, anger, and defeat in his gaze. I didn't flinch. This was the price of his betrayal, a price he had to pay. As I left the building, the weight of the last few weeks began to lift. Daniel was out of my life, professionally and personally. It was time to rebuild, to focus on my son and my work. But above all, it was time to heal. The aftermath of Daniel's exposure was like a storm that swept through our lives, leaving a trail of revelations and consequences. His professional disgrace was just the beginning. A few days after the confrontation, I received a call from Daniel. His voice, once confident and arrogant, was now laced with desperation. "Emily, we need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. I can explain everything," he pleaded. I held the phone tightly, my resolve unwavering. "There's nothing to explain, Daniel. I've seen the evidence. It's over." "You can't do this to me. You're ruining my life." His voice rose in anger. "You did this to yourself," I replied, the bitter taste of betrayal still fresh. "You made your choices, and now you have to face the consequences." He was silent for a moment, then his tone changed, becoming more sinister. "If you think you can get away with this, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy me." The threat hung in the air, but I wasn't intimidated. "I'm not afraid of you, Daniel. You've lost your power over me." I hung up, feeling a sense of empowerment. Daniel's threats were empty, the last gasps of a man who had lost everything. The news of Daniel's affair and professional misconduct spread, and the reactions were immediate. His social circles shunned him, and his professional network crumbled. The man who had prided himself on his image and status was now a pariah, his reputation in tatters. As for me, I focused on rebuilding my life. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, as Daniel had little ground to stand on. I was awarded full custody of our son and a significant portion of our shared assets. But it wasn't the financial settlement that gave me satisfaction. It was the knowledge that Daniel's downfall was of his own making. He had underestimated me, thinking he could control and belittle me without consequence. In the end, it was his arrogance that led to his undoing. He had sowed the seeds of his destruction, and I had merely helped them grow. As I closed this painful chapter of my life, I looked forward to a new beginning, a future where I was free from Daniel's shadow, free to be myself and provide a better life for my son. Daniel's fall from grace was a stark reminder of the price of betrayal and arrogance, a price he would continue to pay long after our paths had diverged. The finality of the divorce brought a mixture of relief and reflection. The house, once filled with tension and discord, now resonated with a quiet peace. My son and I adjusted to our new life, one where laughter began to replace the echoes of arguments. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, my son looked up at me, his eyes curious. "Mom, why don't we see Daddy anymore?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes people change, honey, and sometimes it's better to be apart than together." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and turned his attention back to the photos. In his simple acceptance, I found a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. The business thrived as I invested more of myself into it, my parents' legacy becoming a testament to resilience and hard work. The community rallied around us, their support a stark contrast to the isolation that Daniel now faced. Rumors reached me occasionally about Daniel's struggles. His career had stalled, his social circles had evaporated, and the woman he had an affair with had left him. It seemed that the life he had chosen was crumbling around him. I felt a sense of poetic justice in his downfall, but it didn't bring me joy. Instead, it served as a reminder of the cost of deceit and selfishness. My journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught me invaluable lessons. I learned the importance of standing up for myself, the strength in vulnerability, and the power of letting go. As I looked at my son, growing up so quickly, I knew that the most important lesson I could teach him was respect. Respect for others, for himself, and for the choices people make in life. Daniel had become a distant memory, a chapter closed and left behind. My focus was now on the future, on building a life filled with purpose and joy. In the end, the greatest revenge was not in seeing Daniel's destruction, but in my own reconstruction. In rising from the ashes of our broken marriage, I found a version of myself that was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. I had emerged from the storm, not unscathed, but undefeated. And in that triumph, I found my peace.